Lesson two of American history in World War One. Today, we're going to talk about America and its involvement in World War One and things leading up to World War One and the time period before America actually joins the war. So, the first thing to note is that while World War One erupted due to the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Europe, America took the stance of neutrality, and by definition, that means that we don't pick a side. We traded equally as equal as we could with both sides. There was a lot of economic gain to be had. America didn't enter the war largely because of two factors. One, the fighting was happening 3,000 miles away, and so there was no fear that it would ever come to America, somehow accidentally spilling over into our borders. And two, there was no viable reason. There was no overt action against the United States. While the action of assassinating Archduke Franz Ferdinand was a horrible event, it was not against America, the government, or its people. And so, since it doesn't fit into any of those categories, then America had no viable reason to join the war in Europe. We did have economic ties. We were very, very close economically, especially with the Allies. Great Britain and France, we traded a lot with, but we also traded with Germany and Austria-Hungary to large degrees. And as the war wears on, that equality of trade will actually kind of tip, and we'll trade more and more and more with the Allies. And partially due to, we'll talk a little bit later about how Great Britain blockades Germany and doesn't allow any trade in, that plays in a large factor. German U-boats will go out into the trade lanes, out into the Atlantic Ocean, trying to sink any supplies, any food, any arms, any ammunition, any soldiers coming in from outside of Great Britain or France to make sure that they can kind of even the tide. These German U-boats or submarines tried to warn as many of these ships as possible by surfacing and then contacting these vessels and saying, hey, we're about to sink you. We know there's arms and ammunition on board, but we don't want to kill people needlessly. So when possible, they warned them and had the ships empty before sinking them. There's even tales of humanitarianism where the German Navy, if this happened out in the middle of the Atlantic where they possibly would not be able to reach land, would tow the survivors within close proximity of Allied territory before then submerging. But it's not always they're not always able to do the signaling. If there's warships or military craft of any kind nearby, the submarines were forced to do this, surface only to periscope depth, then fire a torpedo, and all hands on board would be lost. And through these actions, there were three ships, passenger vessels, that were sunk that really angered the American people. There's the Arabic, which is a British passenger vessel. There were a couple of Americans on board, American civilians. Knowing that there was arms and ammunition on board, they sunk the Arabic. They also sunk the Sussex, which was a French passenger vessel that had 80 innocent passengers on board. A couple were rumored to be American, but we're not 100% sure because the manifest went down with the ship. And then the most notable was the Lusitania. In May of 1915, the British passenger liner Lusitania had almost 1,200 passengers on board, and 128 of them were American. This is a huge loss of life for American civilians in this war zone. And America, the public opinion after the Lusitania is sunk is such that Germany is now evil, and they are much more accepting of going to war, although at this time there's not yet a reason to go to war. But the Lusitania really starts to move Americans to think that war is a possibility. In 1916, we have a presidential election. We have Woodrow Wilson, who is the Democratic incumbent. He holds the office in 1916, coming in. His platform is one of success, that the new freedom platform that he had run on in 1912 is successful, that they are successfully tearing down tariffs and tearing down trusts and working on completely and wholesale changing the banking system. There's success there. Largely, his platform will reign that, hey, we have not gotten into war. World War I's waging in Europe, and We are not involved, and that's because of the leadership of Woodrow Wilson. Although Woodrow Wilson never says that directly, because he does fear that at some point in the near future, America will be pulled into this war. Woodrow Wilson notably was anti-women's suffrage. He did not want women to have the right to vote, didn't believe that that was the right course at this point in time. On the flip side, you have the Republican candidate, Charles Evans Hughes, governor of New York, Supreme Court justice. He was very anti-war, said we need to stay out of war, but criticized that Wilson wasn't doing enough to ensure that long-term we stayed out of the war. He was an endorsement of women's suffrage. He believed that women needed the right to vote, but was unable to pull those progressive votes away from Wilson. And Woodrow Wilson will end up winning the 1916 election in a very close race, much closer electorate-wise than the 1912 election, where he had won with 435 votes. In the election of 1916, Woodrow Wilson will end up winning with 277 electoral votes, where you only needed 270 to win, but the popular vote was only about 600,000 in difference. As Wilson gets back into the saddle, he decides that it's time to try to call for peace, to ensure that this war in Europe comes to an end, and he pleads to all leaders to have a peace without victory, a peace among equals, meaning that there's not a winner, there's not a loser, that we lay down arms and the war just ends. And that's really easy for the U.S. to say, not being vested. We haven't done anything to be involved in this war. But at this point in time, when he gets inaugurated, keep in mind, it's 1917, and this war is waged for almost 3 years. And millions of people have died in the warfare, and the atrocities, and the economies of these countries have been stifled by the war, and there's people starving. And this plea from this neutral country to end this war is almost laughable. Germany and Austria-Hungary will ignore us. The Allies tell us basically to stay over across the Atlantic. America at this point, even though we're pleading that the war ends, we do care who wins. Very much so. We have this massive trade debt that's beginning to accrue with the Allies, not so much with the Central Powers because of that blockade. Great Britain had blockaded Germany early on, making sure that, guns, ammunitions, any raw materials for manufacturing, fertilizer, or any agricultural products don't make it in, effectively putting a stranglehold on Germany, who is dependent on many of those things. Our merchants were turned away at gunpoint. They could not enter Germany. We were turned away and said, hey, you can deposit those things in Great Britain or France, but not in Germany. And this war debt that was accruing as we continued to trade meant that Americans could possibly lose everything that we had sent over there monetarily wise if the Allies lost. And so America starts to really think about entering World War I just for an economic investment. As a notable side effect of the blockade, Germany will have about 750,000 people starve to death before the war ends because their agricultural land is not great. They need a lot of fertilizer, and they import many agricultural products to stay afloat. And that British blockade really was winning the war for Great Britain there. What really provokes America at this point, where American public is really angry about the sinking and killing of innocent Americans, but it's the Zimmerman telegram, or the Zimmerman Note, that actually tips us to entering the war. There's a proposed alliance between Germany and Mexico that if Mexico accepted, they'd declare war on the United States in North America, which would effectively keep America locked in a war on this side of the Atlantic. We wouldn't want to fight a two-fronted war and send half of our army over to Europe and half of them stay here, but it would keep us locked. And Germany thought they had a chance to win the war long-term, and Europe won because the Russian monarchy drops out in 1917. So when Russia is removed from the equation, Germany really only has to fight France in continental Europe and try to take over Britain, which is via sea, but they felt it was a very winnable battle. The promise to Mexico, and for their efforts, they would gain the territories of Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona that were lost during the Mexican-American War. This is sent, and Huerta does not take any action on this. But the British intelligence office that intercepts this and decodes it says this is the golden ticket. We need to get this into the hands of the Americans so they know right away. And they also understand that an action like this will more than likely bring us into the fold of war. And not that we're a major military power at this point, but the additional manpower, the additional manufacturing, the additional agriculture could tip the tide of the war in favor of the Allies. And with Russia dropping out, it makes a very ideological battle now between the brutal monarchies of Kaiser Wilhelm II in Germany and the King of Austria-Hungary and the Emperor of the Ottoman Empire, those monarchies that have total control and give no liberties or freedoms to their people, and the democracies that are of France, the French Republic, and the British Parliament and the United States. And so World War I gets painted as this battle between ideological government differences. And Wilson will take, after getting the Zimmerman Note, he'll take the proposition to the congressman. On a rainy day on April 2nd, he will address Congress saying, property can be paid for, the lives of peaceful and innocent people cannot be. The present German submarine warfare against commerce is a warfare against mankind. We are glad to fight for the ultimate peace of the world and for the liberation of its peoples. The world must be made safe for democracy. We have no selfish ends to serve. We desire no conquest due dominion. We seek no indemnities. It is a fearful thing to lead this great peaceful people into war, but the right is more precious than peace. So there's a lot of moving pieces here with this. First, he's saying that the German submarine warfare is unacceptable and has to be ended. You cannot just be shooting civilians. And then he's saying that we're glad to enter this war to make sure that liberation of peoples and freedoms is secured and that democracy and our democratic ways of life are secured. We are not entering this war to gain territory. We're not looking for conquest. We're not looking for indemnities. We're not looking for payments for winning, like reparations, when we'll talk about that at the end of the chapter. We seek none of that. We are simply entering this war to end it. So it's over and it's done and everybody can move on. Okay, and then this last bit is, it is a fearful thing to lead this great and peaceful people into war, but the right is more precious than peace. And the right that he's addressing there is the right of the democratic process to take place, in that the Congress is representative of the people and the feelings and the thoughts of the people, and they have a deliberation and they can talk and agree or disagree that we should go to war. And that whole process is protected, and it is a right by our democratic way of life. And under the monarchies of Germany and of Austria-Hungary and of the Ottoman Empire, there is no discussion. The emperor, the king, gets to decide, we're going to war, we're not going to war, and nobody gets to argue with him. That is the right that we must cherish. That is the right that we must uphold. And that right is more precious than remaining in a time of peace. So he delivers this war resolution speech on April 2nd, 1917, and the Senate will draft up a war resolution, a rough draft of a declaration of war, and they will approve it on April 4th, 2 days later. And 2 days after that, on April 6th, 1917, the declaration of war passes the House of Representatives. So in 4 days' time, it is proposed and it is drafted and approved through both houses. Very, very quick for our Congress, which means that they're ready for war, and the American people by and large are also ready for war. And with that, that ends the second section of American history, and we will be back to talk about the entrance of America to World War I.